This is the Fireside Chat about data visualization and accessibility. It is hosted by the Data Visualization Society, which is a nonprofit. We are a professional organization that fosters a community of professionals as they grow and develop their data visualization skills, and it's free to join if you are not a member yet. It is datavisualizationsociety.com. And we provide all sorts of resources, including these fireside chats on a variety of topics. I am Amy Cesal. I'm the community director for the Data Visualization Society and one of the co-founders. So today's fireside chat is on accessible data visualization. And I want to thank Excella for providing us with the Zoom so that we can have more than, the small amount of people. We can have as many people as join today, and it really opens it up to a broader community, and it allows us to make this free. And a special shout out to Amanda, who hooked us up with Excella. She works there and is also doing our closed captioning. Let's start by doing introductions. Doug, do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, I'm Doug Schepers. I'm the director of Fizz Studio, which is a startup doing accessible data visualization. And prior to that, I worked at W3C for a decade doing things like SVG and web audio and web APIs and web payments and a whole bunch of other things at W3C.
Sarah, how about you?
Sure. I'm a web developer. I work at Microsoft on one of the accessibility teams, and I work with a lot of teams on their data visualizations and actually use the SVG graphics module that Doug helped write a fair amount.
Good.
Yeah.
Melanie, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm Melanie Mazanec. I'm a software engineer for a civic tech startup called Bloomworks Digital. Currently working on some state government work. Before that, I worked for the city of Asheville, which is where this all started for me. I was trying to make sure that our public-facing dashboards were truly available to everyone, and to support government transparency in that way.
And just for everyone else participating today, there is a chat box which you can post any comments, but there is also a Q&A box which you can find at the bottom. And so if you type questions into that Q&A box, I might ask them to the panelists. So I'm really looking for your questions to help sort of guide this chat. And so don't put them in the chat box, put them in that Q&A box. We're going to start out today talking about what's one common misconception about accessibility in data visualization. Oh, did we lose Doug? We have lost Doug. Okay, Melanie and Sarah, what is one common misconception about accessibility in data visualization?
I think for me, it's that it's all alt text, or that because data visualization tends to be heavily visual, that the only approach is to provide like alternatives like manual descriptive alt text or tables, and that there's no point in trying to do anything else.
To me, I think it's that it's figured out, or that there's like an answer already. I think something that happened after I worked on semiotic a little bit was that people approached me to see if it would meet their like legal requirements, and I was kind of like, well, it's hard to tell because they're not very clear. So there's still a long way to go.
Yeah. And one other is that accessibility is only about vision. Both that, like, I think there's the one I mentioned for me. There's the two that I was thinking of, that is that you can't do anything about low vision and no vision accessibility, and also that vision is the only accessibility that matters. And so it's hard, so no other accessibility for you.
Yeah, I think that tends to be a big problem, is that there's like one way to solve it, and that it's like sort of this tight scope, and that's not it's not a very broad definition of accessibility. Doug had a brownout and he's trying to rejoin, so we're just going to continue this conversation and maybe he'll hop back in. What recommendations do you have for making interactive visualizations accessible? where alt text clearly can't replace an immersive experience. So sort of going beyond just alt text.
Yeah, I actually like, there's a JavaScript library called HighCharts that I like some of the stuff they've been doing with keyboard and screen reader accessibility, where you can use the keyboard to navigate through specific data points and data series and generate names for each one. It's a slightly different, like, it's kind of similar to the data table approach in that you're still like navigating data point by data point, and you don't get a kind of a nice snapshot. Like, you don't get a nice like overall view through that, but it is at least like another way to present a graph to screen readers. And also there's a way to highlight each series and fade other series, which can help with cognitive accessibility by kind of removing some visual distraction. So that's a nice thing you can do on the web that you can't do on print. And there's also things like choosing accessible colors, adding borders between different, like if you have a bar graph with different colors, making sure you have a border between each one to preserve contrast, because picking colors for data visualization can be really difficult. And there's some like, out on the like perspective feature side, there's some cool projects around using AI to generate descriptions about trends in data in charts. And I actually worked on a project last year that tried to do something like that, where you'd actually feed it the raw data and it would generate a description of the trends it pulled.
Yeah, I think to echo what Sarah is saying about keyboard navigability, especially, I think there are standards that do exist that cover some interaction behavior, and so I think trying to adhere to the standards that do exist, so that there's a predictable experience available, and then also being humble and willing to admit that what we're experimenting with might be wrong or might be confusing, and making sure that there are kind of bailouts for people who are like, this is confusing, I need to get out of this graph, and making sure we're not forcing users to interact with something, but kind of still trying to give as much freedom and as many options as possible. And then to that end, also usability testing, and making sure that what we're doing really truly makes sense to people, making sure we have a chance to get some feedback and aren't just kind of like, inventing what we think might work.
Just to catch you up really quick, Doug, the question was, what recommendations do you have for making interactive visualizations accessible where alt text clearly can't replace an immersive experience?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that the other two really covered a lot of the groundwork. I think one of the challenges with interactive stuff is, like, I've seen so many examples of animation, right? How do you touch, how do you get in animation into a sort of an accessible context? And actually Sonification, for example, is one really good way of doing that. In the article we just published for the Data Visualization Society on the Nightingale media magazine, I linked to an example that is doing sonification with COVID-19 data. I have mixed feelings about sonification, but I think that as an additional technique to some of the other stuff that Sarah and Melanie mentioned, I think it can be effective. I really want to reiterate what Melanie said, which was that we're still in an experimental phase with accessible data visualization. There are standards, but they're really just sort of the mechanical background stuff. It's not really about how to make the experience good. And those things will be emerging, right? We're all working on things to make a sort of set of expectations around data visualization, but almost anything you do to make your audience, to give your audience access to the data is good, right? If you do something, if you experiment with something, especially if you share it with the community, that's the most valuable thing. Think about the what was it, the rose diagram that that Nightingale did back in the 1800s. We look at that now, right? It's sort of a weird pie chart plus, you know, like extended out into I sort of a radar plot in a way. And we look at that now as data viz professionals, right? We look at that now and we say, oh, that's not a very good representation of the data, right? That's not very effective. But it was super effective at the time, and it moved the bar for our expectations, right? Data visualizations, all the new techniques that are coming out, it's everything, every little incremental change improves the state of what other people will be able to do. So I say experiment as much as you can with accessibility, learn about accessibility, and do what you can to meet the widest possible audience.
Yeah, so what are some of those innovations around data visualization that stretch the boundaries of our field and give you hope for greater accessibility of visualization? What are some of those projects?
Oh, to me?
To anyone.
Well, the things I've seen, I want to reiterate what Sarah said. I think AI and auto descriptions is very interesting. Because people are so familiar with, because, for example, blind people use screen readers. They're more proficient in screen readers than any other technique. I think that's a very interesting way forward because it doesn't require special hardware. I think that what, unfortunately, John isn't with us today, but John Gardner at ViewPlus and some others are doing great stuff with tactiles and embossing, where you actually have you can feel the shape, and is really great for giving a gist. Sonification is another really is an advanced technique that can be used to good effect. Let's see. What I don't know. What else are y'all aware of? I mean, I think sort of the state of the art is stuff that Melanie has done in semiotic, right? Where, you know, just letting people navigate each data point as if it were a table, so that
Melanie,
that's
talk more about semiotic.
Yeah.
Sure. So I worked on semiotic a little bit right when I first went to the city of Asheville, and you know they weren't quite sure. I just started, and they're like, well, why don't you see if you can make our dashboards accessible? And it just turned out to be this huge rabbit hole, right? Because there wasn't like one easy answer, like I could finish the project in a week. It's kind of something that I don't even work there anymore. I'm still, you know, kind of puzzling on it and working on it, trying to figure it out. So I ended up contributing a little bit to semiotic and doing sort of the best I could with keyboard navigation and making it possible, and adding ARIA labels, you know, to try to make it possible for someone to choose to interact with the visualization, kind of use the keyboard to kind of get a sense of what's there. I sort of ran into a wall though when it got to, you know, like hierarchical diagrams and network you know, they're sort of a whole other ball game, right? Once you get past kind of the stuff that is sort of easily analogous with tabular data. And I will say sonification is really exciting. And I was expecting Doug to talk more about that because I know we had talked about it once, but I'm really interested in that area because I think right, one thing that we're kind of stuck in is where it's data visualization, and there are other modes to experience data. There are other means of communicating, and so when we kind of limit it to the concept of visualization, I think we're almost limiting our imaginations from the get-go for what's possible. So I'm excited at sonification and some of the tactile work and some of the, like, you know, getting out and exploring, like, what are we really trying to accomplish here? What is really important about what we're communicating? And to that end, I know that some of the sonification work, I think at SAS, you know, some of the people working on that are blind themselves, which I think that's exciting too. The more the momentum we have when we build more things that are accessible, and when we are able to include more people, and we're able to make it more possible for people to advocate for themselves and build for themselves. And so I'm really excited about the momentum we can have by kind of continuing to collaborate and work on this problem.
Can I say, oh, sorry. Go ahead, Sarah.
I was just going to say, I think I also want to raise the idea of like evaluating who your user base is, because the sonification and tactile graphics are really interesting in that, like, so one of my coworkers on my team is blind, and his background is in IT and tech and not data science. So and we've tried, like, we actually got a 2D, I guess it is 3D Braille display that had multiple levels that each pin could go up, so not traditional Braille, which is either just raised or flat, and it was two-dimensional, so you essentially had a canvas where you could theoretically display images and graphs, and we tried displaying different graphs. They work better when you have very good contrast, or you can enforce good contrast. But we tried displaying it, like using it to go through a few graphs, and we've tried sonification, and I think the main takeaway is that you need to train on both of those things to get any information from them.
Yes.
So if you're building data visualizations for somebody who is a data science professional, like you're building an application for machine learning, and the only people who are going to use it are going to have the time to really really train in understanding 3D graphics and sonification, then both of those become more of a possibility. But if you're like a newspaper building data visualizations for everybody, or if you're trying to just reach a broad audience, I don't, like, your blind users are probably not going to be able to interpret those unless somehow like 3D graphics never, because it's too expensive. People aren't going to have that. Sonification, if somehow like years in the future we integrate that as like the way to interpret data on the web, maybe, but it's going to need training. So it's like that trade-off, right? Like, who's your audience? Can you trust them to get training in how to interpret these things?
That is so true. That is my main. I was so excited when I first discovered sonification, and also tactile graphics. And I've even Mark Hakkinen from ETS showed me a cool tablet that uses electrical impulses to create a haptic surface. And so you run your fingers over it, and it actually feels like it's ridged, but it's actually just electrical stimulation. But the problem with all of these things is, as Sarah says, it's the training, right? That you don't want to, you want to respect the attention span and skill level of your audience, right? One of the techniques that Melanie and I both use, like I have Fizz charts, which is my library, and Melanie contributes to Semiotic, and I know that Microsoft Power BI has some of the same capabilities of like allowing you to navigate the actual chart, and there are other libraries that do this as well, allowing you to navigate the actual chart itself. And the downside to that, first off, it's so much better than anything we had before. It keeps things in sync. You want to have, whether you do a background table or you have the SVG actually navigable itself, you want to keep the data updated, synced between those two sources, right? You don't want to link to a data table that's wrong, right? Or that's out of date. So you want to, one of the nice things about generating the navigable model in the SVG is that you can keep it live and concurrent with what is being seen on screen. But one of the downsides to that is we're still asking people to walk through the data in a serial fashion, step by step, just like with a table. And that takes more time and effort and cognitive load than letting people see a gist or get a summary. And those summaries, that's why I'm excited about the idea of summaries, is because they can let the person know, okay, do I want to dig into this, or what's the main takeaway? and then I can decide if I want to dig into this. But that's not always possible, right? It's not always possible to capture intent. We're doing some work about capturing intent dynamically, right? But maybe the best you can do is provide a background table or like a hidden table or a navigation. And that's going to meet the needs of most of your users, because most of your blind users, at least, are going to be using screen readers. And so you meet them where they are with those tools. And sonification and haptics and these things are fantastic techniques. Some of them require some training. And I think that's where Amy comes in and says, Doug, you mentioned blind people. There are other disabilities, though, we should think about. What are those other disabilities?
Sure. Actually, I'm going to invite John who has just joined us.
Oh, excellent.
John, do you want to hop on screen? Or do you want to, and can you give a little bit of bio or introduction about yourself?
Let me start by apologizing. I'm on the Pacific Coast, and I thought the time was Pacific time. So
no worries.
That's why I'm late.
We're happy to have you.
And my camera is actually covered over and on another table. So besides, you don't want to see me. I'm ugly. Doug can testify to that.
You're a handsome man, John.
So very quickly, John Gardner. I am the founder and president of ViewPlus, a company that makes the world's leading tactile graphics and braille embossers, and also a lot of software. I founded the company a number of years ago because as a physicist, I lost my sight in mid-career and had no access to graphics, and I wanted to do something about that, and did. So.
And John is the one who introduced me to sonification at an SVG conference, probably
10 in Paris, I believe.
Yeah. So 10 years ago, John introduced me to sonification. It blew me away. And his tactile work is very impressive.
So, Amy, I'm not sure, should I continue or?
Sure. So we were talking about innovations around data visualization that stretch the boundaries of our field and give you hope for greater accessibility of visualization. And I know you've done some work in that area. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. We have something that we call the IVEO technology. It's actually been on the market for a number of years, but seems to be a big secret. And I'm trying to make it less of a secret. I realized early on that in order to access complicated graphics, simply verbal description wasn't good enough. And very few blind people can actually read tactile graphics, anything at all complicated. Very few blind people can read Braille for that matter. So there's a technique that was developed by, not me, but a professor whose name I'll think of in a minute in Australia back in the late 80s, to have a tactile graphic that you feel and that it talks to you. You can also use non-speech sonification as well on some things, and I do that. But the idea is you have the two-dimensional access, but your fingers are really not good enough to replace your eyes, so you need to use your ears as well. And or if you are deaf and blind, you can read this in Braille, an attached Braille display. But for example, just a very popular one that we show in all sorts of shows, a map of the United States. So you touch the state of Oregon, and it says Oregon, and you double tap it, and it says it's a great state, has very low COVID incidents, and then you tap the state of Texas, and it says Texas, and then you double tap it, and it says it's full of very stupid people, or something like that. And for scientific graphics, you can do more of the same thing. You can put a fairly verbose description in, which is more than you can actually grasp in hearing, but you can then browse it. And for example, something like a GIS map, that's where you would want to sonify. So you can run your fingers across, and the dark colors, you have high tones, and the light colors have low tones. And this technology actually works well. The real difficulty is that it does require a computer or some sort of a device. And you do need to be able to touch something that then transfers that information to the computer. And we use a touchpad or a touch screen, but I would sure like to have a more convenient technology for doing this. And we're developing several, but right now I use my touchscreen computer and just print a copy of the tactile and pin it on the computer and feel it. And the technology works really very well.
Can I touch on something that John alluded to?
Sure.
So I've used John's technology, and it is a good combination of technologies, like where you have the printout, right? You put it on top of your screen and you move your fingers along it, and then it can tell you, it can actually, you can hear things, or either speech or non-speech sounds that sort of reinforce what your fingers are feeling. And that sort of multiple sensory thing actually is really helpful for a variety of different learning styles as well, even outside of accessibility. But one of the things he touched on is putting a map down, right? And that's something that's a real challenge with, for example, a screen reader only approach. And that is the topological layout of things. It sometimes matters. If I'm looking at, for example, a voting map or a COVID-19 map, right? It matters which state is next to another state, right? That actually had the topological layout of a complex thing. It's not just a grid, right? It's which states touch other states. It's not a grid, and it's not alphabetical. It's so being able to at a glance, that is, say at a feel where something is a rate of COVID-19 infection, for example, is higher or lower, is really useful. Ed Summers, who I think you're going to have on a future show, he works at SAS. He demoed a really cool use of sonification, and I loved his metaphor. They picked a point in the center, and he said you sweep your virtual cane around this point, sort of like a radar, like an airplane radar. And he says you sweep your virtual cane around, and based on the tones, you can get a sense of what is around this central region. I thought that was a really interesting technique that's using sonification in a way that's not simply a linear, like, sort of thing. It's actually using it in a more topological way, and that topology is actually a really interesting challenge with regards to getting the full picture of a visualization.
Ed's technology is very similar to what I've done. He can use a tactile overlay, but he tends to use things that you don't so much need a tactile overlay, where if you're spatially aware with your fingers, you can actually get the sense of it without the tactile feeling. And many times I will do that as well. Quite frequently that's good enough. But if I really want finally really good access, I just put myself a copy. As it happens, I have an embosser right on my desk, and I can do it. It takes a minute or two. Wonder where I got that.
I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit to talking about testing and talking about users, and especially users with disabilities. So you don't want to overuse their time. How and when do you involve users in these new processes or testing out accessibility.
Melanie, you talked about that a little bit.
Yeah, I can start here. So I'm coming from the civic tech community, and in that community we have a saying from Lauren Ellen McCann, which is build with, not for. And so it's the idea of that, you know, it's not that you're doing work like for another person, you're just going to figure out all the answers and then, you know, ship them something perfect that works for all their needs and suits them and that they love. It's that you start with people who are going to use what you're building, and you make sure that from the very beginning you're you know, listening to them about their experiences and their needs and what they want, and you know, what will actually be useful to them, rather than kind of starting with your own assumptions about all of those things. So I think that's one thing. Another is what I found. I tried again with the city of Asheville when I was working there. I tried to you know, try to put together like an advisory panel from people in the community, and I kind of ran into the problem that I was asking for a lot of labor, and a lot of time from people. And so there's kind of the trade-off, right, where I think what really would have been the ideal scenario, and what I love to do in organizations going forward, is to start with users, but also to pay them for their time ultimately, and to, you know, pay users for the expertise they're offering you in your process, and in designing something with you. So that's what I would love to see. I think I think a lot of organizations and processes are pretty far off from that still, but I think we can start moving toward it by starting our processes by kind of doing away with our own assumptions, and really making sure we're talking to users.
Yeah, my team actually does get to pay people to people with disabilities specifically to do user testing, although we have a separate problem, which is that like a lot of the products that my team works with are enterprise products, and especially the ones that involve data visualization are often like products that professionals are going to use who are in very specific fields. And when you narrow your scope of like people who you want to user test with first to like people who are in this field who have the knowledge to like use this product and not be completely lost, and then also people who are part of like any user testing firm's pool of people with disabilities, you run into things like people who work in machine learning, like the percentage of people who self-identify with the disabilities and work in machine learning is much smaller than the percentage of people who self-identify as being disabled in the wider population for, you know, all of the structural reasons. And it, like, even if you're willing to pay, it does get really difficult to find people. You can user test with people who aren't in that field, but then you're like, you have to try to interpret every single result as like, are they confused because of the way we're doing this, or are they confused because they're trying to use a tool that they have no background for?
Right.
Yeah, I imagine that's much less of a problem if you're working on data visualization for a broader audience, which has its own set of problems, because then you're trying to make data visualization for a broader audience and make it understandable, and you can't like rely on people having training and like learning all of these specialized keyboard shortcuts and, you know, extra settings that you've buried in a menu somewhere. But yeah, it does get difficult even if you can pay.
I think in some ways designing for a broader audience can sometimes, I don't want to say be easier, but it's a different challenge, and it kind of, I think for me, it forced me to consider multimodality a lot more, and to take it a lot more seriously. As I needed to convey whatever information I was trying to convey. If it was important enough to include in one, you know, in text or in a chart or something, then it was important enough to convey in a couple other alternative ways, so that, you know, when people came to a dashboard or a graphic or whatever, that was, you know, put out by the city government, right, for public consumption, that everyone could have kind of a chance to consume that information in a way that suited them. So in a way, it kind of forced the design in a direction that was, you know, maybe would be redundant for something that was internal facing or facing toward experts, but since, you know, it was the topic of like, you know, permitting, which most members of the public are not experts on. It really drove the design to be a lot more general, I think.
I think there's another aspect to you have to test with the users that you're going to be using, the audience, the actual the demographic that you're actually going to be testing with, as everyone else alluded. But and you have to come into it with a humility, right? Because let me put it another way. You need to learn to use a screen reader yourself, and you don't have an excuse not to, because every operating system has a free built-in screen reader, right? It's not always the best, right? But it's what's going to be used. I mean, you might not have access to JAWS yourself, for example, because it's an expensive program, but you should learn to use a screen reader, and you should first test things sort of at a mechanical level that you can actually use it with a screen reader with, for example, by yourself, so you can get into the mind frame of what somebody who's using a screen reader might be doing, right? That helps inform your development process. And you need to, but then you also need to come into it with the humility, realizing that you are not actually probably proficient with a screen reader unless you use a screen reader on a daily basis. The way you're using that screen reader is probably not the way your users are using that screen reader. So yeah, you can tab through the individual values, but is that really the mode that somebody using a screen reader is going to have, right? So that's where respecting their time starts with you understanding the tools that they are using and working towards those and doing initial testing with those. But then actually, when it comes down to, is this thing usable and not just theoretically usable, then you have to involve people with disabilities.
I'm gonna just define JAWS. JAWS is one of the mainly used screen readers, and it is more expensive, and you have to have a JAWS license. So that is what JAWS is. It's a type of screen reader.
It stands,
John,
it stands for Job Access with Speech, by the way, which is a sort of an indication of where we're going here. We're not trying to just, this isn't just a nice to have. This is, accessibility is something that people need in order to do their jobs, in order to be independently, like they need this access. John, you started your company because you needed this thing in order to do your job, right?
Yes, indeed.
John, do you want to talk a little bit about using a screen reader?
JAWS, by the way, is reacting to strong competition. The Microsoft Narrator in recent versions has gotten to be usable. For several years, it was just impossible to use. But there's a free screen reader called NVDA, Non-Visual Desktop Access, that I find to be the best screen reader. I like it. I have JAWS. I don't use JAWS except for testing. JAWS is something like $1,200 to $1,400 range, but they will sell you a, quote, home version for your personal use for $100 a year. And since I'm using it personally, not for the company, that's what I have. Actually, most of the time, Freedom just gives me a free copy because we do a software exchange, but the new company is strange. Anyway, using a screen reader is something that you do develop a technique, and there are a lot of similarities between the way I would say more expert blind users use it. I've been sort of amused by watching some of the discussions on some of the listservs. People asking for how you navigate a web page. And I've read several of those, and they're not too much different from each other and from what I do, but there are some differences, and I've learned a few things. I'd like to say a couple of things about how you respect the time of people and yet get what you need. And one of the things that one needs, if you do not have a disability and you want to make something that's accessible, you do need to involve people with disabilities from the very, very beginning. because you have to have some sense of where you're going. If you don't do that, you don't know where you're going, then you're probably going to do it wrong. And if you do it wrong, that's a mess. If you do it right, it doesn't actually cost any more than doing it wrong. It's just that you do it right, and it makes it easy. And you need to involve people with disabilities at various critical places, but certainly not every place. You need to make sure that you've got an idea where you're going and you've got an overall design concept. But you need to keep working on it until you get to a point where it's worth testing. People with disabilities, if you give them something that's kind of fun and clumsy, then they can really help you a lot. As a person with a disability, I have a different problem because I can make something that works really well for me, and then I talk about humility. Then I go out and I test it with other blind people, and I find that they use it totally differently than I do. And what I think is intuitive, they don't, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a certain arrogance that comes with being a blind person that I've had to get over to make something that really works for lots of people. I don't really need to involve other people at the beginning or in various stages of my development, but there are times that I do. There are times in the development that I do to make things flexible enough that really large numbers of people use it. And I pay them. I don't pay them a lot, but I at least pay them enough that they don't find it insulting. I try to do testing at meetings, and I will arrange, for example, a lunch meeting and serve them lunch and pay them some amount of dollars maybe, but not very much.
Can I touch on something? We've been talking about fully blind people and screen readers, and that's of course obviously a big issue with data visualizations. But one thing that I found is that my friends with low vision benefit from having visualizations, and they tend to use magnifiers as opposed to screen readers, and they really like visualizations because reading large blocks of text, reading data tables is actually cumbersome to them. And so I don't want people to think that they have to be experts in any of these fields or all of these fields or understand every disability, but I want to point out that actually visualizations are themselves an accessibility technology, right? They are a cognitive accessibility technology. They help those of us who can't look at a block of numbers and see the patterns inherently in it. They help us understand this in a way that we couldn't understand without the use of this assistive technology that is data visualization. And it also goes to the point that John said, you know, he thinks about things. John is a physicist. John is smarter than me, certainly. I don't want to presume, and he's very experienced with the screen reader. That's not going to be the experience of every screen reader user. When you've met one person with a disability, you've met one person with a disability, right? It's not, you need to think about, gosh, there are lots of different things. There's like, just because somebody has a visual disability, if they're low vision, they might really want you to concentrate on things that Sarah was talking about before, like high contrast, good color choices. Amy, you published a really nice article about things you can do for low vision, where, like for a line chart, for example, putting the label in line with the line as opposed to using a legend, and that's going to help people with cognitive disabilities. It's going to help people with low vision. Using thick lines and patterns as opposed to like thin, elegant lines. That's going to help somebody with low vision.
Yeah, I think
a lot of other considerations, right? Sorry, Amy, go ahead.
Yeah, that sort of leads nicely into my next question is what are some resources for people who are just starting to think about accessibility and data visualization? Where can people start?
Oh my.
I just published an article on Nightingale, the the Data Visualization Society official newsletter.
Not newsletter, our Medium publication.
Your Medium publication. And I linked to a bunch of resources there, but there's articles coming out periodically about accessibility and data visualization. I linked to Amy's article in my article. That's a good one. And Sarah, you've almost certainly published something nice about this, haven't you? Have you got
Not
something?
really, not
No?
publicly.
Oh, okay.
I don't know. I feel like this is kind of hard because like it is very very new, not new. It like Melanie said before, there aren't good answers, and especially because data visualization is such a broad field, what's going to work, like the advice for a line chart is going to be very different from the advice for a flow chart, and you can't like you know,
right?
yeah,
like with hundreds of data points. How are you gonna,
or something with a time series where you get to watch something evolve over time and you have like multiple axes of data versus two. So it's both like there isn't like a good advice that you can give for the data visualization or like an article that will tell you the accessibility for the data visualization because it's like it's very hard to translate across different types of visualizations. And also because there aren't any great answers, so you get like when you look up articles, it helps to know like the experience of the writer because there's just a lot out there and some of it is good. Like if Doug wrote it, then trust it. But it's hard because you have to have a certain amount of knowledge to even evaluate whether an article is giving you good advice, which is not a great answer for someone looking to learn. It's really like try something and then ask people with disabilities about it, right?
And then publish about it, and then publish what you found out, right? Like,
yeah.
Like that's one of the things that we need. This is a conversation starter, right? Like John's been doing this for 20 years, John.
Oh, more.
And I don't think that you feel like you have the answer, right? You have an answer, right? But and it's a good answer, but there's other things to be done in this.
Well, let me say, I think I am closer to the answer than most people, maybe than anybody else. But the answer starts with something that I knew, but I never really learned as a physicist. And that is, you have to make something easily accessible, you have to start with an elegant diagram. If you look in so many scientific journals, you see these cluttered diagrams that are in there to try to squeeze in way too much information into one figure. And the reasons for that are largely because they're page charges or used to be page charges. And you have to keep the number of figures down to some reasonable minimum. But you just get so many crappy, inelegant figures. And I've certainly published plenty of those in my time. but after I lost my sight, I really began to appreciate how crappy they were and the fact that other people did even worse. I really think that a relatively simple, elegant diagram, you can make that accessible to anybody.
Right.
If you do it right, it is just accessible.
Yeah.
Maybe there are things like the thick lines, for example, that have to be somewhat overcome, but you overcome this by using multiple modal senses. And there are going to always be some people who are not going to find the perfect accessibility solution accessible to them. Somebody who is deaf and blind and has a mobility problem is maybe going to be left on the outside. And in that case, he would or she would need for a human being to, quote, make that data visualization, that graphic, accessible to her. But for the most part, I think one of the myths, that was one of your questions, Amy, one of the myths that I think is among so many people, especially in the blindness field, is that graphics have to, quote, be made accessible. And I just don't believe that. I think that it is completely possible to publish graphics that are accessible out of the box. And I would love to see a day, or if I don't live to see it, I know that there will be a day when that will be true, that will be accessible to all but 3 people in the universe.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I'd like to throw a small wrench in, just because I think partly because a lot of the products I work on are not simple. Like I just worked with a team on a flowchart, like a machine learning flowchart builder. Like you weren't just consuming the information in a diagram, you were actively creating a flowchart with all the tools involved. Yep. And I really don't think there's going to be an answer that will work for that, and also for a scatter plot, and everything in between. Maybe and then there is, like we mentioned, there are so many different disabilities that can affect your ability to consume displayed data, in that you could have perfect vision and mobility and have dysgraphia and have difficulty consuming certain forms of visual information, but it doesn't mean a data table is consumable. You need essentially for that, maybe the AI description generator would be the best, because some verbal form of description of trends is going to work better than a visual one. But for someone else, where verbal descriptions just don't work for consuming information, a visual plot is going to be much better. So I guess if there is a solution programmatically representing data such that the user could customize how they consume it, would be an interesting path to pursue, which is kind of similar to how accessibility works in general, in that accessibility APIs are a programmatic representation of the information in an interface that different assistive technologies consume, mostly screen readers, sometimes speech recognition, but it could theoretically be more. So maybe if we could find a way to perfectly programmatically describe information in a wide array of data visualizations, we could let users choose exactly how they consume it, whether that's through sonification or tactile graphics or generated descriptions, or controlling colors on a data visualization where you still have the tension between people who need high contrast, or maybe also people who need low contrast because too much visual clutter is overwhelming, or causes migraines.
Right.
So I don't disagree with you, but I think that it is possible to have a graphic in which those sorts of handles are there. You just turn the handle that makes most sense to you. One thing that you said I also agree with is actually my comment was really for graphics that stay still. If you're looking at a two-dimensional graphic that doesn't move and you don't interact with other than to ask what it is and things like that, I think that my statement is pretty nearly true. But once you get to interactive graphics where you can change things and design it yourself, then then life is a great deal more complicated. And I'll agree with that for sure.
Yeah. Complicated life is fun.
Yeah, we wouldn't be having this conversation if it were easy.
True.
I think to that end, in terms of resources, given that we all work in kind of different spaces, you know, we have different users we're considering, different audiences, and different data we're trying to present every day. I think something that I found really helpful was to eventually, when I first learned about, was learning about web accessibility, I wanted to find a checklist. I wanted to find an easier way to consume the information. And eventually I just sucked it up and read the standards. And I really read through them and tried to learn. And I, obviously I of course have not memorized them. But what it did do for me is that now I can kind of have have an easier time having like a code smell. And so that when I notice something that someone, that I or one of my colleagues is building that, wait a minute, like wasn't there something in the web content accessibility guidelines about this? So while I don't have them memorized, I think having read through them, I have a better shot at catching things that might be an accessibility problem. Having at least done that, a couple once or more.
I'm going to jump in with some other resources too. Q has been doing a ton of webinars on accessibility, and they are a great learning community. I've also used empathyprompts.com. Empathyprompts.com is just a bunch of seemingly random prompts to get you to experience some sort of disability. It's not perfect, but it does sort of build that empathy. And I think when you're starting to just try and get people started thinking about accessibility, this can be a good way to have them experience some of that difficulty. And then following the discussions, there's a lot of discussion on Twitter. Hashtag A11Y is sort of like the accessibility hashtag. And then there's a couple newsletters too that I follow, and I'll drop those in the communal chat. I think I'm going to wrap up our discussion because we are almost at time. But if their panelists want to talk about or give one example of a data visualization that they think is really good and accessible, I will let you do that with our final minutes.
I'm really excited about what they're doing over at SAS. I was in the same webinar, I think that Doug mentioned, with the radar chart, and it was really incredible, and I'm really excited to see where all the work goes.
I think I'm gonna say, though I think it's flawed to some degree, the sonification that I linked to a sonification example in my article, and the reason I want to push it is because so much information about COVID-19 has been visual, and it is locking people out of critical, important, health information. And so I don't think that the site is perfect, but it has all the data as tabular data, and it has a sonification. And I'm going to say that for topically, it is very important that they are doing that work and making it accessible, right?
So I would like to see two companies that are still work in progress, but they're making really good progress. One of them is company High Charts, Norwegian company. They're really putting effort into making their graphics accessible. Another one is the company Desmos with the online calculator. They're working, they've actually been very good partners for us. They're working to make the graphics something that we can just print on our embossers to make tactile copies. And now they're also making accessible SVGs that are coming out. I think those are two companies that are doing really exemplary work in data visual and visualization.
I don't know if I have one. I do like some of the work High Charts has done. It doesn't come out of the box. You have to, if you use High Charts, you have to make sure you implement it accessibly. But yeah, some of like their keyboard navigation especially, and also labeling and screen reader accessibility is better than the competition that is widely used. My coworker likes them. And I guess this isn't like a production ready thing that you could use, but the little hackathon project that I worked on about a year ago that did AI generation based on data, and it could pull data from, it could try to pull data from visual charts, or if you fed it data, it would generate a description of trends. It's not there yet, but I think the direction is really cool.
I mean, I think there's a lot of companies that are doing interesting stuff with the accessible data visualization. I just encourage people to, and projects, right? Like Semiotic. I encourage people to experiment and just, but also look around. If they need an out-of-the-box solution, look around. There's some of us that are offering out-of-the-box solutions, right?
Yeah, I'm excited that we've had this conversation. I'm excited to keep this conversation going. I had some panelists who couldn't join us today, so expect another chat about data visualization and accessibility in the future. Doug and Melanie both published articles on the Data Visualization Society Medium publication called Nightingale today, so check out those. And I want to thank both Doug and Melanie for like helping pull this panel together too. It could not have happened without them. Again, this is Global Accessibility Awareness Day, GAAD. So check out Global Accessibility Awareness Day too, and they had a bunch of other webinars and events that were going on today too. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you participants. Thank you panelists for sticking around and doing this. Have a good day. Happy Global Accessibility Awareness Day.
Thank you, Amy, for pulling this together.